Mr. Arnott, you have the floor.
Thank you. Commissioner, first of all, I think there is a huge change in terms of public opinion in the United Kingdom. If you go back to the referendum in 2016, at that time there were campaigners who would have accepted the possibility that we might end up with a situation where the UK and the EU did not end up with a deal, that they would accept the possibility that no deal might happen, but they would always have advocated a deal. What we're seeing now, I think, is a change in that because of the state of negotiations, and you and I will have very different views on how we've arrived at this point, but because of the current state of negotiations, what we're seeing now is a huge rise in those who are actually not just saying that they would accept the possibility of a no deal, but there are people who are now clearly advocating no deal, and that is something which is now starting to register quite substantially, 30% plus, in opinion polls in the UK. So I think I would caution perhaps that where we're talking about this as, well, Parliament has just voted narrowly to say they don't want a no deal. Well, that's correct, but they've not legislated to stop it, and the default legal position is that. A couple of questions, if I may. Firstly, this proposed regulation, bluntly, will be seen within the UK as paying €17 billion into the EU budget for 2019, even in the event of a no-deal Brexit. And that, in the British press, I can assure you, will go down very much like a lead balloon. It will be perceived as, to use the common parlance, something of a unicorn. So I wonder, what is your basis for believing that the UK would, under those circumstances, agree to this? Secondly, I'd like to ask, in terms of the regulation on Erasmus, as I understand it, is a separate regulation to this one. What happens, for example, if the UK were to agree to the Erasmus conditions but not agree to this? Are those two going to be considered as two separate things, or is it going to be a case of nothing is agreed until everything is agreed?
If the British side asks for an extension of 2 or 3 months, and there are reasons for that, I think there's a good chance that the member states would accept that unanimously. But in the 8 or 12 weeks, there needs to be the possibility of achieving progress, and that there must be a withdrawal agreement at the end of that. A longer extension, according to the legal services, would go against European law, which says that a member state must guarantee active and passive voting rights. There are other scenarios, such as we saw with German reunification, but there were 18 million people who joined the EU there, and but the UK is already a member, so it's not becoming a new member. So there's no reason to put off a vote in the case of an extension of 2 to 3 months. Fisheries, that's a very sensitive issue, because they're fishermen from France, Ireland, Germany, Denmark, fish in UK waters because we have a single market. And this right would fall the day after an exit, and that is why Commissioner Barnier always said it's important that if we want to maintain fishermen's rights after a Brexit, then that if the Brits agree to that, then we would have to give some ground on something else as well. So there would have to be a quid pro quo. The chance that we have an exit without a deal is not zero. It's not 80%, but it's 30 to 60%, I would say.
Now, just looking at it from a net payer perspective, our proposal is one that would mean that the UK would pay rather more than would get back for 2019, but get back through the programs, that is. But it would be wrong not to reach out in this way by the European institutions. If you like, this is a sort of mini exclusively budgetary withdrawal agreement for 2019 only. It's a small component, a small part that would fit into a broader whole of an agreement. So it's a sort of mini withdrawal agreement, if you like. Now, if the British no longer pay any further, even though the 2019 budget has been adopted, even though the MFF has been adopted till 2020, that's a tricky question. There's only international courts and international law that would apply. And that's the only way to resolve this issue.
The United Kingdom Prime Minister has made clear in statements that she's made, she has said that the United Kingdom will meet its obligations in any event. The 2019 budget, as the Commissioner has made clear, is an obligation under international law entered into at the time the United Kingdom was a member state. This agreement by the 18th of April would underline that. If those two things are put together, the interpretation of the law and the commitment of the UK Prime Minister, then the UK will sign up to this agreement. I believe this is sensible. I think we should agree to it when the time comes.
And what strikes me is the resilience of the EU in this. We can see in the run-up to the elections, we can hear candidates making critical speeches about Europe in their electoral campaigns, but once they're elected, they have a different stance with regard to the EU, with regard to the Eurozone. Some 4 years ago, there was a Prime Minister who for 6 months had fought against the agreements put forward by his country's creditors. Then put the whole thing to a referendum. The people voted against it. But in the following week, the Prime Minister signed off on the agreement. And there are many cases of this sort of thing. There is a sort of a resistance to the EU economically, on a monetary level, which is starting to grow on in the social sphere. And it may be that the UK is strongly feeling this European resilience in the face of all of this. And if you bear in mind, if you look at the cataclysm that would result if they're in the case of a no-deal scenario, there might be people on both sides of the channel who say that they would like the D-Day, as it were, to be put off. And if we do that, the EU would remain a member of the Great Britain would remain a member of the EU, and the candidates to the European elections could stand. What is the Commission's view on that, Commissioner? A period of extension up to the point where we can organise a referendum in the UK on a definitive exit, or a staying within the a remain scenario?
Personally, I wouldn't be surprised if the deadline was extended perhaps to May, and then we'd see whether, in fact, the Brits would be voting MEPs or not in the European elections. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for the replies you'll be sending us. We'll be in permanent contact.